According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics, more than 1.7 million Americans have a minimum wage job, and if you fall into this category, it's likely that you have not had a raise in more than 10 years. According to PolitiFact, since 2009, the federal minimum wage has stood at $7.25 an hour, although 29 states, including Washington D.C. and some cities, have higher minimum wages. However, if you talk to President Joe Biden, he believes that it's long past time that anyone working 40 hours a week should not be living in poverty. However, Biden's desire to raise the federal minimum wage has met significant opposition on the other side of the aisle in Congress. So what should we make of the fight for 15? Hoyt Bleakley is a professor of economics at the University of Michigan, and he joined me this week to discuss the matter in greater detail. I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. I certainly hope so. But if you're ready, Professor, I'll welcome you to the program, and I'm excited to talk to you about the current minimum wage situation there across the border. Great to be with you this afternoon, and thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure.
So, Professor, I'll start you off by simply asking you about your general thoughts on President Biden's push to raise the minimum wage and how you think that battle is going.
Well, I guess it's easy to get lost in some of the technicalities of the way Washington works. That's not something I know as much about. I know it was listed as one of his priorities, and of course the minimum wage is sort of on the medium to low side in terms of recent history. And he said that's been a priority. I think, you know, if you look around the country, of course, there are many states and some cities where that already is the minimum wage. And then there are other places where the minimum wage is set at the federal level effectively, or is constrained by the federal level. And those also tend to be places where wages are quite a bit lower. So if you compare New York City to rural Mississippi, you know, the cost of living is markedly different, the wages are markedly different, et cetera. I don't know, your question was more about the politics though. I could talk more about the economics of it if you'd like.
Yeah, sure. So let's pivot to economics. When we look at the Congressional Budget Office, they estimate if we go to a $15 minimum wage by the end of 2025, it'll put 1.4 million people out of poverty, but it'll also, or out of work, and 900,000 people out of poverty. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on that finding and what it means from an economic perspective to raise the minimum wage for all 50 states.
Yeah. Well, those numbers sound a little high. The spirit of the estimate, I think, is right. That kind of standard economic theory tells you that when you make something more expensive for, you know, kind of a reason that's outside the box, right? Then people or firms will demand less of it. And so, but of course, that doesn't mean that the demand for that thing goes to zero, right? The units that are purchased, if we talk about this, the market for oranges, just to kind of depersonalize it, if you said, we'll put a price floor on the market for oranges, fewer people will buy oranges, but but there's still going to be the hardcore consumers, the people who really like oranges, and they will be willing to pay the higher price. Now, it also might mean that, so with people, you would expect the same sort of effect. That doesn't mean that it's a bad policy, because, of course, the government does lots of policies that are meant to alleviate poverty, and they all have that problem, right? They all have the problem that if you try to alleviate poverty by, say, giving people money, right, you have to get that money from somewhere, and that has a cost. Or if you try to alleviate poverty by, giving something away, that people 30 years ago, when I was a kid, there were government programs that would buy cheese from farmers and give them to people who were, under half the poverty line or something like that. That itself is sort of distortionary, because the farmers end up producing kind of too much cheese, and it means that other things are more expensive. So all these things are going to have trade-offs, right? So it shouldn't mean you don't do it. At some level, what you want to do is you want to kind of figure out, what are your values, right? Are your values are that I'm okay with the level of dispersion in income that we have in the society, or I'd like it to be, presumably most people would say they'd like it to be less dispersed, or at least there to be less poverty. And then you start talking about, well, how costly is it to do that? And the minimum wage is sort of one of those policies, at least by the way you framed it. Right, that is to say that some people are going to be winners because they keep their jobs at a higher wage, and some are going to be losers because they lose their job and they're going to have to be picked up by something else. Maybe that's more use of the welfare system. Maybe they work under the table, right? And then who knows what their wage is if they work under the table.
Absolutely. And Professor, as you know, the coronavirus has devastated sort of the gig economy jobs for people that are in the minimum wage sector and depend on those jobs. So from an economic perspective, and as it relates to the gig economy, how do you think we can upstart these people from an economic perspective?
Well, I'll come back to the way we started the conversation, which is hopefully things are going to go more back to normal. And I think when things go back to normal, we're going to have a lot of those trends, kind of continue, right? There's going to be supply of people who are willing to participate in the gig economy, and there are going to be people who are willing to buy from it. Some aspects of this gig economy have done well, like the people who want food delivered to their homes, right? A lot of restaurants that I will go to and do carry out, it seems like all the other people who are getting carry out are delivery services and such. But again, once we go back to a more normal economy, amazingly, like one of the weird things about this coronavirus recession is that a lot of people actually didn't lose their jobs, didn't see their income go down. And in fact, they've been accumulating money that they're going to want to spend. So, when it becomes possible to fly places, people are going to fly places. People are going to go where the cost of living is so high. I don't see it as being as much. The cost of the minimum wage that we described before is just not so great, because wages there are already too high, or not too high, but so high.
And do you believe that people that are currently supporting, obviously, when something is as particularly popular with a segment of a population, the majority, it tends to ground better support. So do you believe that when we look at supporting this initiative, that messaging is also important?
Well, again, I'm an economist, so we are notoriously tone deaf about any of these things, right? It is, the minimum wage is certainly something that sounds good. It particularly sounds good to people who would make below it otherwise. But I think I think that they should be presented and given an honest presentation of it as well, right? Which is that this isn't going to be a free lunch for everyone. As you said at the beginning, there are these estimates that suggest some people will lose their jobs. So it sounds appealing. And I think it should be sort of in the set of tools that we use to reduce poverty, but no one should be of the view that, oh, this is a free lunch.
And what do you think about the effect on small businesses if the federal minimum wage is raised?
I don't know. I think people spend too much time discriminating between the small and the large businesses here. I think, you know, all the businesses think about what am I paying for this type of labor or whatever they're paying for, right? And they think about other ways to do it differently. Doesn't matter whether it's big or small. You know, the big businesses, I think, you know, there's this weird thing in the political dialogue where they say, well, the big businesses can just absorb this cost. And, you know, I think about a company like Amazon that makes great profits, sure. Hypothetically, if it were paying minimum wage, which in many places it's not, right? In many places it's paying above the minimum wage. But hypothetically, if we forced them to raise their wages, do you really think they wouldn't sit and have a long think about whether we can use robots to do some of these jobs? I mean, this is Amazon, right? And we're talking about pulling things off of shelves and putting them in bins and moving the bins places and so forth, right? It seems like an easy thing to automate. So I don't see them as being sort of likely ones where there's just sort of this pile of money that's going to immediately and forever go to workers. The issue with small businesses, I think, is that you could see a lot of small businesses where it's actually hard to replace them with capital, right? So if you imagine a cashier at a service station or something like that, right, where you basically need to have a single person on working there. But that's the way I would set it. Is the business small or large? It's that can the business be replaced? Can what that worker does be replaced by, you know, a machine or by providing the service in some other way? That's really where these estimates about the employment loss comes from.
And as things start getting back to normal from an economic perspective, I'm curious to get your thoughts on the willingness for business owners to sort of reinvent themselves and offer more opportunities to minimum wage workers and the costs that'll bring to a business. And how big do you think investments in like vocational training programs will be as well?
Well, I would put it a slightly different way. I would say when a lot of the training that's really important that people get is actually at work. It's not really a natural thing to go into a room and be told what to do by a stranger. That's like not the natural human condition, right? And so work is sort of an opportunity to learn skills that are, you know, that are definitionally about being in the workplace. There are some vocational skills, you know, about operating certain types of machinery that might be relevant for training, but also might be things that you could learn on the job. The minimum wage sort of makes that a little more difficult because part of, if you want to think about working as being sort of like training, you don't want to pay somebody if they're basically getting education from you, right? If on-the-job learning is important, then in a sense you're receiving a benefit from the job besides just the money. And one criticism of the minimum wage is it kind of interrupts that, right? Because you'd like to have it be that people can come in with very low skill, and I don't mean skill in the sense of book learning, I mean skill in the sense of being able to prosper in a workplace, being able to work with customers or coworkers or whatever. Those are skills. So being able to learn those, but in a sense, workers that don't start with those skills kind of need the ability to come in at a lower wage and learn them and become more productive. So the minimum wage, in a sense, if it cuts that off, then it basically increases the need for vocational training, because the firms aren't willing to sort of pay for those workers to learn soft skills.
And when we look at the Health and Human Services poverty standard, do you agree with how the government currently measures poverty, or do you think we should add things such as more money for childcare or food assistance and that sort of a thing? I guess what I'm asking is, how would you assess the current HHS poverty standard, and how would you like to see it improved, or do you think it's good the way it is right now?
Well, there's a deep problem, which is how do we compare, kind of living standards over time? And by some measures, you could say we are all phenomenally wealthy in the sense that even some of the most poor people in the society have access to products that were unavailable to the kings and queens of Europe of 100 years ago, right? That's sort of the bonanza of technology. So the people who want to say, well, that factor is really important, then that suggests poverty is actually less than you think it is because of all these material advancements. Now, the other way to think about poverty is that it's not really an absolute notion, it's more sort of a relative notion, in which case, if everyone in the society has this good, then you're sort of impoverished if you have less of it, right? And so these things that would have been luxuries a while ago are now necessities. And so that's kind of the counter argument to that perspective. But I mean, I think it's valid to say, if you ask someone, I'm going to give you, let's say $20,000 of income. Would you rather spend it today, or would you rather spend it 100 years ago, adjusting for inflation? And I think most people probably, once they looked at how few things they had available and how bad the standard of living and quality of life was back then, they would pick spending it today. So that in that sense, it suggests that poverty is really, we sort of overstate poverty with these indices. Now, the question that you made about childcare, it arises because our society is very different than it was 50 or 100 years ago, right? So 100 years ago, you would have made some comment about paying for childcare, and they would have laughed at you because, of course, there was this concept of moms are at home, and the dads are the breadwinners, and so there was no childcare per se, or people maybe that would involve a multi-generational household or some such thing. And we just have so much less of that our society has changed so much that really those things, something like childcare, really has become a necessity in a world where both parents work. And so, of course, that should be factored into the basket. There are other things that are, I think, more complicated. I think people have this perception, particularly sort of educated professionals who, are on Twitter and so forth, who talk about how high the cost of living is, but they also perhaps don't factor in that they have moved to places, to like cities that are very expensive. And so in that sense, they might view themselves, Twitter users, intellectual Twitter users in their 20s and 30s might think that they're extremely poor, but they're extremely poor because of this choice they've made to, want to live with a large footprint in Manhattan or some such thing. So, changes in our society, as our society changes, we should change our notion of what poverty is. As we get richer, we should say, well, we're going to tolerate less poverty. And so that suggests that, we want to put more resources into, we want to define whatever poverty is at actually a higher material standard of living as the society gets richer.
Yeah,
But
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious to end on this note, Professor. How do you think the debate for whether to raise the minimum wage will end? Do you think we'll eventually get to a place where the federal standard is $15 an hour, and we'll accept that as a way of life?
again, that's a political question, not an economic question. I think that if both parties want to have it as a, so I'll hazard a political interpretation here, right? Which is there's an easy way for this not to be a political issue, which is set it and index it to inflation. And then it just kind of bumps up as time goes on. And then neither party, effectively what happens instead is we have these cycles where there's a push to make the minimum wage higher, and it goes high, and then inflation kind of erodes the real value over a decade or two, and then there's a push to move it up again, and inflation kind of brings it down. And so it's this perpetual political battle that, you know, politically, I guess we could get rid of it by indexation to inflation. That doesn't get rid of fundamentally what I started with, which is this kind of values question, which is, you know, how much poverty are we willing to tolerate in the society? And, you know, that's not a question that I can answer because, you know, I'm just a technocrat, right? That's a question for society to answer, which is, you know, how much inequality is too much and how much you're willing to spend to get rid of it or reduce it.
Absolutely. And when we look at that, when I have one more for you, when we look at living on what now is the federal minimum wage, $7.25, any person trying to make a living off of that can't necessarily do it. So, do we look at this from an economic perspective, coupled with giving people dignity? And how do we make sure that people are more educated on how far their dollars can stretch?
The dignity question is hard. I think, you know, there is this view that goes through Western thought, right, which is that people get dignity from sort of meaning, from being valued by other people. How that occurs obviously is different in different societies. You know, some would say part of that is working for money, but of course that's not the only thing. Other people, you know, I'll spend more of their time in volunteer work, or you know, a lot of home work that's done at home, you know, historically by women, and maybe we're moving to an era where it'll be more shared by moms and dads. You know, people say you can get dignity from that. So I resist kind of the tight linkage between dignity and money. But I do think that if part of the cost of the minimum wage is that people are unemployed, then you have to wonder, well, is it worse, you know, for those people who lose their job by leaps and bounds than it is for the people who get a small increase in their wage? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a question that one should confront. Now, I should also say there are other tools for dealing with this, right? So in the US, we have the earned income tax credit, such that people who earn a certain amount, you know, a certain low amount, through the tax system, that is in effect bumped up by getting tax refunds at the end of the year. In fact, they're not even tax refunds. They're like, these are sometimes called the negative income tax, because you're actually getting more money than you put in. And so that's a way of increasing the spending power amongst the poor. and it's a way that, in a sense, makes everyone pay for it, or makes the taxpayer pay for it instead of the businesses that employ minimum wage workers. So that's not a, that's something that you should have on the side where you say, well, that's another tool for doing this. It has its problems because, you have to raise the taxes to do it, but it doesn't have the problem that it sort of specifically attacks on firms that pay the minimum wage.
Professor, I really want to thank you for your time, your insight and perspective on the future of the federal minimum wage in America. Really enjoyed our conversation, and I want to thank you for being here today. It's most appreciated.
All right, thank you, Kevin. Most kind. Good luck with your podcast.
Fantastic.
I'll see you again at number 400.
Of course, I'll mark it down, and your reservation is already booked. So.
Thank you.